The Colorado Rockies stretched endlessly before Jackson Sterling as he rode his black stallion, Midnight, across the rugged terrain of his ranch. At 32, Jack had built his life around solitude and hard work, far from the deceitful world of high society that had once broken his heart. The year was 1889, and the frontier still offered refuge for men who preferred the honest company of cattle and horses to the false promises of civilization. Jack's weathered hands gripped the reins as he surveyed his land, 2,000 acres of mountain pasture that he'd carved from the wilderness with his own sweat and determination. After Victoria Ashford had humiliated him 5 years ago, choosing a railroad baron over a common cowboy, Jack had sworn off women entirely, especially those from wealthy families. The morning sun was climbing over the peaks when Jack spotted something unusual near his cabin, a flash of emerald green fabric that didn't belong in his brown and gold landscape. Spurring Midnight forward, he discovered a young woman collapsed beside his well, her elaborate dress torn and muddy, her dark hair escaping from what had once been an elegant arrangement. She was unconscious but breathing, her pale skin marked by exhaustion and exposure. Jack dismounted carefully, his instincts warring between suspicion and concern. Everything about her, from the quality of her dress to her soft, uncalloused hands, screamed wealth and privilege, the very things he'd learned to distrust. "Ma'am?" he called softly, kneeling beside her. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, revealing the deepest blue Jack had ever seen, like mountain lakes reflecting a summer sky. For a moment she stared at him in confusion, then panic flooded her features as she scrambled backward. "Please," she gasped, her voice cultured and refined with a Boston accent. "Please don't send me back. I'll do anything, work for you, clean your house, just don't make me go back to him." Jack frowned, studying her face. She was beautiful, undeniably so, but it was the desperation in her eyes that gave him pause. He'd seen that look before in wounded animals, the terror of something hunted. "Who's him?" Jack asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Cornelius Blackwood," she whispered, the name seeming to drain what little color remained from her cheeks. "My father arranged our engagement. He's a monster. He told me exactly what he planned to do once we were married, how he'd control every aspect of my life, my inheritance." Jack's jaw tightened. He knew the type, wealthy men who saw women as property to be acquired and controlled. "What's your name?" "Isabella Whitmore," she said, then added quickly, "but I can be anyone you need me to be. I can work, I can learn. I just need somewhere to hide until I can figure out what to do." Isabella Whitmore. Jack had heard the name. The Whitmore shipping fortune was legendary even out here in Colorado. This woman was worth more money than most men saw in a lifetime, yet she was begging him for sanctuary like a common refugee. "You're a long way from Boston, Miss Whitmore," Jack observed, helping her to her feet. She swayed slightly, and he steadied her with a firm grip on her elbow. "I've been traveling for 3 weeks, Isabella said, her voice growing stronger. "I sold my jewelry to buy train tickets, then a horse when the train stopped running this far west. The horse threw me yesterday and I've been walking since dawn." Jack looked at her torn dress, her muddy boots, her tangled hair, and felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't some pampered princess playing at adventure. This was a woman who'd risked everything for her freedom. "I don't take in strays," he said finally, though his tone lacked conviction. "I'm not asking for charity," Isabella replied, lifting her chin with surprising dignity despite her bedraggled state. "I'll earn my keep. I may not know ranch work, but I'm not afraid to learn." Jack studied her for a long moment, weighing his options. Every instinct told him to send her away, to avoid the complications that came with wealthy women and their problems. But something in her eyes, a fierce determination that reminded him of his own fight for independence, made him hesitate. "1 week," he said finally. "You can stay 1 week while you figure out your next move. But you pull your weight and you don't bring any trouble to my door." Relief flooded Isabella's face, and for the first time since he'd found her, she smiled. It transformed her entire appearance, revealing a warmth and vitality that her exhaustion had hidden. "Thank you," she breathed. "You won't regret this, Mr. Sterling. Jackson Sterling. And Miss Whitmore?" He fixed her with a stern look. "I better not regret it." As Jack led Isabella toward his cabin, he couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully ordered life was about to be turned upside down. He'd built his world around predictability and solitude, but something told him that Isabella Whitmore was going to challenge everything he thought he knew about himself. The mountains stood silent witness as the unlikely pair walked toward an uncertain future, neither knowing that this moment would change both their lives forever. 3 days into Isabella's stay, Jack found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about wealthy women. Instead of complaining about the rustic accommodations or demanding special treatment, Isabella had thrown herself into ranch life with a determination that both impressed and unsettled him. She woke before dawn without being asked, attempting to help with morning chores despite having no idea what she was doing. Jack watched from the barn as she struggled to carry water buckets that were clearly too heavy for her face set with stubborn resolve even as her arms shook with effort. "You're gonna hurt yourself," Jack said, taking the buckets from her hands. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and he felt an unexpected jolt of electricity at the contact. "I can manage," Isabella protested, though her relief was obvious. "I told you I'd earn my keep." "Earning your keep doesn't mean breaking your back on day 3, Jack replied, noting how the morning sun caught the auburn highlights in her dark hair. "Ranch work takes time to learn." Isabella's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "In Boston, the most physical work I ever did was arranging flowers. I know I'm useless here, but I'm trying to learn." Something in her voice, a vulnerability beneath the determination, made Jack's expression soften. "You're not useless. You just need proper instruction." Over the following days, Jack found himself becoming Isabella's reluctant teacher. He showed her how to gather eggs without startling the chickens, how to milk the cow without getting kicked, how to mend fences and tend the vegetable garden. Isabella proved to be a quick learner, absorbing his instructions with an intensity that surprised him. "Why are you really here, Isabella?" Jack asked one evening as they sat on his porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. "A woman with your money could go anywhere, do anything. Why run to the middle of nowhere?" Isabella was quiet for a long moment, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold. "Because nowhere else felt safe," she said finally. "Cornelius has connections everywhere, New York, Chicago, San Francisco. His reach extends to every major city in the country. But here," she gestured toward the vast wilderness surrounding them. "Here, I'm just another person trying to survive." "And what happens when your week is up?" Jack asked, though he found himself dreading her answer. "I don't know," Isabella admitted. "I suppose I'll keep moving west, maybe try to reach California. Start over with a new name, a new life." The thought of Isabella leaving sent an unexpected pang through Jack's chest. Over the past few days, his cabin had felt more alive than it had in years. Isabella's laughter echoed through rooms that had known only silence, and her presence had brought a warmth that had nothing to do with the fireplace. "What about you?" Isabella asked, turning to study his profile in the fading light. "What made you choose this life? You're educated, I can tell from the books in your cabin, the way you speak when you forget to be gruff. You could have been anything, gone anywhere." Jack's jaw tightened, old wounds threatening to reopen. "I tried the civilized world once. Didn't work out." "Because of a woman," Isabella said softly. It wasn't a question. Jack's green eyes met hers, and for a moment, his carefully constructed walls cracked. "Victoria Ashford. I was young, stupid, thought love could bridge any gap. Turned out money talks louder than the heart." "She hurt you badly," Isabella observed, her voice gentle with understanding. "She taught me that people like you and me don't mix," Jack said bluntly. "Oil and water, different worlds. Always ends the same way." Isabella felt a stab of pain at his words, though she couldn't quite understand why. "People like you and me? Rich and poor. Privileged and working class. You'll go back to your world eventually, Isabella. They always do." The conversation ended there, but Jack's words haunted Isabella through the night. She lay in the small guest room he'd given her, staring at the ceiling and wondering why the thought of leaving felt like a physical ache in her chest. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Isabella was hanging laundry when she heard the thunder of approaching horses. Her blood turned to ice as she recognized the lead rider, Thomas Blackwood, Cornelius's younger brother and chief enforcer. "Jack," she called, her voice sharp with panic. Jack emerged from the barn, his hand instinctively moving to the gun at his hip as he took in the scene. 5 well-dressed men on expensive horses, their city clothes and soft hands marking them as clearly as if they wore signs. "You Jackson Sterling?" Thomas called out, his voice carrying the arrogance of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Depends who's asking," Jack replied, his stance casual but ready. "Thomas Blackwood. I'm here for Miss Whitmore. Her family's very worried about her." Isabella stepped out from behind the laundry line, her chin raised defiantly despite the fear in her eyes. "I'm not going back, Thomas. Tell Cornelius he can find another heiress to torment." Thomas's smile was cold and predatory. "I'm afraid that's not an option, Isabella. Your father's already signed the contracts. The wedding is in 2 weeks. Over my dead body, Isabella said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. That can be arranged, Thomas replied pleasantly, his hand moving to rest on his gun. But it would be so much easier if you just came quietly. Jack stepped forward, placing himself between Isabella and the mounted men. The lady said no. Time for you boys to ride on. Thomas laughed, a sound devoid of humor. This doesn't concern you, cowboy. Walk away and no one gets hurt. Everything on my land concerns me, Jack said quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. And Miss Whitmore is under my protection. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Isabella could see the calculation in Thomas's eyes, weighing the cost of a fight against the value of bringing her back alive. This isn't over, Thomas said finally, wheeling his horse around. We'll be back with more men. Enjoy your last few days of freedom, Isabella. Cornelius is very much looking forward to your wedding night. As the riders disappeared down the mountain trail, Isabella felt her knees give out. Jack caught her before she could fall, his strong arms wrapping around her trembling form. They'll be back, she whispered against his chest. And next time they'll bring an army. Jack's arms tightened around her, and for the first time in 5 years, he felt the stirring of something he'd thought was dead, the desire to protect someone he was beginning to care about more than he should. The attack came at dawn just as Jack had predicted. Isabella woke to the sound of gunfire and Jack's urgent voice calling her name. She dressed quickly and found him at the window, rifle in hand, his face grim as he surveyed the approaching riders. 12 men this time, Jack said without turning around. Thomas brought reinforcements. Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs as she peered through the curtains. The riders had surrounded the cabin, their weapons drawn and their intentions clear. Thomas sat his horse in the center of the group, his smile visible even from a distance. Jackson Sterling. Thomas called out. Send out Miss Whitmore and we'll leave you in peace. Refuse and we'll burn you out. Jack's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. Isabella, there's a root cellar behind the cabin. You can hide there until... No, Isabella said firmly, surprising them both with her resolve. I won't cower while you fight my battles. This is my choice to make. She moved toward the door, but Jack caught her arm, his green eyes blazing with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Don't be a fool, he said roughly. You know what they'll do to you. And I know what they'll do to you if I don't surrender, Isabella replied, her voice soft but determined. I won't have your death on my conscience, Jack. For a moment they stared at each other, the weight of unspoken feelings hanging between them like a bridge neither dared to cross. Then Jack's expression changed, becoming something fierce and possessive that made Isabella's breath catch. You're not going anywhere, he said, his voice low and intense. Not with them, not with anyone. Jack. No, listen to me, he interrupted, his hands framing her face with surprising gentleness. I spent 5 years telling myself I didn't need anyone, that I was better off alone. But these past weeks with you, Isabella, you've brought my heart back to life. Isabella felt tears spring to her eyes at the raw honesty in his voice. Jack, we're from different worlds. You said so yourself. I was wrong, he said fiercely. I was a coward, hiding behind old wounds and using them as an excuse to keep people at arm's length. But you're not Victoria, and I'm not the same man who let fear rule his life. Outside, Thomas's voice grew more impatient. You have 1 minute, Sterling, then we start shooting. Jack's hands tightened on Isabella's face, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had begun to fall. Isabella Whitmore, you're the only woman I'll ever love. I know it's crazy, I know we've only known each other a few weeks, but I'd rather die fighting for you than live without you. The words hit Isabella like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her heart race. She'd never expected to hear such a declaration, especially not from this gruff, guarded man who'd become her sanctuary. I love you too, she whispered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. I think I started falling for you the moment you helped me to my feet that first day. But Jack, love isn't enough to stop bullets. Maybe not, Jack agreed, his smile grim but determined. But it's enough to make a man fight like hell for what matters. The sound of splintering wood interrupted them as Thomas's men began breaking down the door. Jack spun around, raising his rifle, but Isabella caught his arm. Wait, she said, her voice suddenly calm with resolve. I have an idea. Before Jack could stop her, Isabella walked to the window and called out to Thomas. I'll come with you, but I have conditions. Thomas laughed. You're hardly in a position to make demands, my dear. Aren't I? Isabella's voice carried a strength that surprised even her. I'm worth nothing to Cornelius if I'm damaged goods. Kill Jackson Sterling, and I'll make sure your brother's wedding night is very unpleasant. I'll fight him every step of the way, make his life a living hell." The threat hung in the air, and Isabella could see Thomas calculating the wisdom of returning to his brother with a defiant, vengeful bride. "But," Isabella continued, "let Mr. Sterling live and I'll come quietly. I'll even pretend to be a willing bride, at least until after the ceremony." Jack stared at her in horror. "Isabella, no. I won't let you sacrifice yourself." "It's not a sacrifice if it saves your life," she said softly, then louder to Thomas. "Do we have a deal?" Thomas considered for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well. But if you try to run again, the cowboy dies." "Understood." Isabella's heart broke as she turned to face Jack one last time. His face was a mask of anguish and rage, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his voice carrying a promise that made her shiver. "I'll find a way to get you back, Isabella. I swear it." "I know," she whispered, reaching up to touch his face one last time. "But until then, stay alive. Promise me." Jack caught her hand, pressing it against his cheek. "I promise." "And Isabella? When I come for you, and I will come for you, I'm bringing a preacher. Because you're going to be my wife, not his." The word sent a thrill through Isabella even as Thomas's men entered the cabin to escort her out. As she was led away, she turned back once to see Jack standing in the doorway, his silhouette dark against the morning light, his promise burning in his eyes like a beacon of hope. The mountains echoed with the sound of departing horses, but the love that had been declared in that small cabin would prove stronger than distance, more enduring than fear, and more powerful than all the money and influence the Blackwood family could muster. 2 weeks later, Isabella stood in the ornate bridal suite of the Blackwood mansion in Denver, staring at her reflection in an elaborate mirror. The wedding dress was a masterpiece of silk and lace, worth more than most people earned in a year, but it felt like a burial shroud. In 3 hours she would walk down the aisle to marry Cornelius Blackwood, sealing her fate as a prisoner in a gilded cage. She'd kept her word to Thomas, playing the role of a resigned bride while secretly planning her escape. But every attempt had been thwarted by the guards Cornelius had stationed around the mansion. Her only comfort was the knowledge that Jack was still alive. She'd received word through a sympathetic servant that he'd survived the confrontation at his ranch. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting her maid. Instead, Cornelius Blackwood entered, his cold eyes taking in her appearance with obvious satisfaction. At 45, he was still handsome in a cruel way, his silver hair and expensive clothes giving him an air of distinguished menace. "My beautiful bride," he said, his voice making Isabella's skin crawl. "I wanted a moment alone before the ceremony." "We'll have plenty of time alone after," Isabella replied, keeping her voice steady despite her revulsion. Cornelius smiled, moving closer until she could smell his expensive cologne mixed with something darker, the scent of a predator closing in on its prey. "Indeed we will. I have such plans for you, my dear. You'll learn to be the perfect wife, obedient, silent, grateful for the privilege of bearing my name." His hand reached out to touch her face, and Isabella forced herself not to flinch. "That cowboy of yours taught you some unfortunate habits of independence, but I'll break you of those soon enough." "You'll never break me," Isabella said quietly, her blue eyes blazing with defiance. "You can force me to marry you, but you'll never own my heart." Cornelius's expression darkened. "We'll see about that. Hearts can be broken just as easily as spirits, Isabella. And I'm very good at breaking things." The sound of commotion from downstairs interrupted his threat. Shouts and running footsteps echoed through the mansion, followed by what sounded distinctly like gunfire. "What the hell?" Cornelius began, moving toward the window. The door burst open, and Jack Sterling strode in, his gun drawn and his face set in lines of grim determination. He was flanked by 2 men Isabella didn't recognize, one wearing a sheriff's badge, the other dressed in the fine clothes of a gentleman. "Step away from her, Blackwood," Jack said, his voice deadly calm. Cornelius reached for his own weapon, but the sheriff was faster, his gun trained on the older man's chest. "I wouldn't if I were you. Cornelius Blackwood, you're under arrest for kidnapping, extortion, and conspiracy to commit fraud. This is outrageous." Cornelius sputtered. "Isabella came here willingly. We're to be married in an hour." "Under duress," the well-dressed stranger said, stepping forward. "I'm Judge Harrison from Colorado Springs. Miss Whitmore's testimony, combined with evidence of your threats and coercion, provides more than enough grounds for these charges." Isabella felt her knees go weak with relief. Jack, how did you? I told you I'd come for you, Jack said, his eyes never leaving Cornelius even as he spoke to her. It just took a little longer than expected to gather the right kind of help. The sheriff moved to restrain Cornelius, who was still protesting his innocence. You can't prove anything. It's her word against mine. Actually, Judge Harrison said, producing a thick folder, we have quite a bit more than that. It seems you've made this same arrangement with several other wealthy families over the years. Miss Whitmore wasn't your first victim, just the first brave enough to run. As Cornelius was led away in shackles, still raging about his rights and connections, Isabella finally allowed herself to breathe. Jack holstered his gun and moved toward her, his expression softening as he took in her pale face and trembling hands. Are you all right? He asked gently, his hands hovering near her as if afraid she might disappear. I am now, Isabella whispered, then threw herself into his arms, not caring about the expensive dress or the watching officials. Jack caught her against his chest, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, and she'd never felt safer in her life. I thought I'd lost you, he murmured against her hair. When they took you away, I felt like my heart had been ripped out of my chest. You found me, Isabella said, pulling back to look at his beloved face. You kept your promise. All of it, Jack said, his eyes twinkling with something that might have been mischief. Judge Harrison, would you mind performing one more ceremony today? I believe this lady and I have some vows to exchange. Isabella's eyes widened. Jack, are you serious? Dead serious, he replied, dropping to one knee right there in the bridal suite, pulling a simple gold band from his pocket. Isabella Whitmore, will you marry me? Not because you have to, not because you're running from something, but because you want to build a life with a stubborn cowboy who loves you more than his own life. Tears streamed down Isabella's face as she looked at this man who'd risked everything to save her, who'd fought against impossible odds because he believed in their love. Yes, she whispered, then louder, yes, Jackson Sterling, I'll marry you. The ceremony was nothing like the elaborate affair that had been planned for Cornelius. Instead, it was simple and heartfelt, conducted in the mansion's garden with only the judge, the sheriff, and a few servants as witnesses. Isabella wore her elaborate wedding dress, but she'd never felt more beautiful than when Jack slipped his grandmother's ring onto her finger and promised to love her for the rest of his days. You may kiss your bride, Judge Harrison said with a smile. Jack's kiss was everything Isabella had dreamed of, passionate, tender, and full of promise for their future together. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless and grinning like fools. So, Mrs. Sterling, Jack said, testing out her new name, ready to go home? Isabella looked around at the opulent mansion with its cold marble and expensive furnishings, then back at Jack's warm green eyes and weathered hands. I've been ready since the day I met you, she said. Take me home, cowboy. As they rode away from Denver toward the Colorado mountains, Isabella felt a peace she'd never known was possible. Behind them lay a world of expectations and obligations, of arranged marriages and loveless unions. Ahead lay a simple cabin in the wilderness, a life of honest work and genuine affection, and a love that had proven stronger than money, more powerful than fear, and more enduring than the mountains themselves. Jack had been right, she was the only woman he'd ever love. And he was the only man who'd ever seen her not as a prize to be won or a fortune to be claimed, but as a woman worthy of respect, protection, and genuine devotion. In the end, that was worth more than all the gold in Colorado.